In tonight's episode of History Talk, we try to answer the question, what led to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union? Okay, welcome back to History Talk. Tonight we're discussing the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. We are joined here tonight by the extravagant William Mullen Thomas, a very prolific history scholar in Mrs. Barnes' class. Say hello to the viewers, Will.
Hello, viewers.
Okay, so I know you specialize in the 20th century history, specifically pertaining to the Soviet Union.
That's right.
In that case, could you give us some background on the Soviet Union and the Cold War?
With pleasure. With the collapse of Nazi Germany after the end of the Second World War and the fall of British colonial power, the Communist USSR and the capitalist United States remained the two largest political superpowers in the world. It didn't take long for conflict to start after that.
Okay, so then how did the conflict start?
Well, the conflict roughly began right after World War II, when the world sort of divided itself in two, with capitalist countries like ours in the West joining NATO, while Eastern countries such as the USSR joining the Warsaw Pact. The US tried to prevent the spread of communism by adopting a foreign policy known as containment.
Alright, so Will, do you think you could briefly describe containment for our viewers?
Of course. Containment was a process described by George Kennan in his long telegram from Moscow to the US. He warned about the dangers of appeasement and encouraged the US to do whatever it could to prevent communism from spreading to any other countries outside of the Soviet Union. This policy continued from the late 40s to the early 80s, and was responsible for conflicts like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War.
So the US felt it was necessary to get involved in those countries simply to stop the spread of communism?
Exactly. The US feared that giving any sort of land to the USSR would create another empire similar to that of Germany in World War II. This idea is known as the Munich analogy.
So that's a lot of conflict over one ideal, don't you think?
Well, it was. But it was thought necessary by the US due to the domino theory proposed by Eisenhower, which essentially said if one country in an area became communist, all the countries around it would become communist as well.
Sure. So now, for a bit of perspective, we found and asked a few people about how they think the Cold War had ended, and we got some interesting responses. Do you care to take a look, Will?
Sure, let's see it.
Although I experienced the Cold War as a child, I really don't know what ended the Cold War. I know that there was a lot of political pressure in Latin America to rid the countries of so-called communism, but I don't think the United States and the CIA understood what that really was. I just remember that as a child, it was, we were all scared, and it was a time where we were really unsure of what our future would be.
The Cold War ended because communism was broken down, the Berlin Wall was taken, free elections were given, and America was free again. That's why I think that the Cold War successfully ended.
I believe the Cold War ended due to CIA involvement in containment, like in Guatemala.
Alright, so the Cold War. We won the Cold War, the U.S., against the Soviet Union because we outspent them. There was a space race, and we beat them in that as well. But overall, we basically made more of everything and outspent them, and they went broke.
In my opinion, the Cold War ended due to U.S. foreign policies such as the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, which limited the spread of communism.
So, what are your thoughts on those answers, Will?
Well, what I found very interesting is that in most of those interviews, there was a lot of talk about US involvement and how the US was the main cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union, when actually the collapse was caused mostly by its own doing.
Whoa. But what about the American influence? Reagan had a lot to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union, right?
Well, Reagan did influence the outcome of the Cold War. His contribution was more of a support to Gorbachev than conflict with communism and the Soviet Union itself. Reagan was often remembered as being tough on communism.
Well, yeah, he took us out of the Cold War. He had to be tough on communism.
That's only half true, though. Reagan spent his first term essentially talking smack about the Soviet Union, like in his Evil Empire speech in 1983. Reagan, despite his violent patriotic rhetoric, did not wish to engage the Soviet Union militarily. He did clearly not view all Soviets as evil. Reagan's second term focused on arms reduction with the Soviet Union and working with Gorbachev to ease tension between the East and West.
But what about his empowering speech about tearing down the Berlin Wall? Didn't that help at all?
Yes, the Reagan speech is very well remembered and is one of the most iconic presidential speeches of all time. And an argument could be made that Reagan's speech stirred civil unrest in Berlin and led civilians to joining to tear the wall down. But the conflict and unrest in Berlin had been brewing since long before Reagan made that speech. Reagan's speech was made in 1987, the wall fell in 1989, and Reagan's speech might represent the collapse. But the citizens of Berlin would most likely have torn down that wall even if Reagan had never made his famous speech.
Okay, so if Reagan didn't cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, what about the other American politicians, such as George H.W. Bush?
George H.W. Bush has a very interesting and often uncredited role in the end of the Cold War. Bush met with Gorbachev at a summit in Malta in late 1989, just as the countries of the Warsaw Pact were coming apart. Bush and Gorbachev spent the meeting discussing a reduction in arms. Bush also talked about expanding on perestroika in order to allow for greater cooperation between the East and the West. Bush and Gorbachev also created the START I Treaty, which is a disarmament treaty. Beyond that, H.W. was president when the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union collapsed. These actions clearly show an effort by both parties to make peace and continue relations. Bush, as well as the rest of the U.S. government, was long past the idea of taking out communist power. At this point, Bush's focus was on reform and actually allowing the USSR to function. While Bush did help end conflict between the East and the West, he did not wish the Union to collapse. He thought unity would allow for much greater peace and stability than independence for the Eastern nations.
So if the United States didn't cause the collapse, what did?
That's a pretty tough question to answer in the limited time we have. But the most popular answer to most Americans would probably be the fall of the Berlin Wall. Cited by Gorbachev's foreign policy advisor as the end of socialism, this single event could be seen as the end, as it showed a real shift from the East to the West, and gave hope to the U.S. that the West would win the war. While the fall of the wall was very important, focusing on it alone ignores all of the events that came before it. As it is with most historic events, the collapse of the Soviet Union cannot be placed on one single event or on one single person. The Union collapsed due to decades of poor political choices and a feeling of social unrest that had been brewing since the Russian Revolution.
Okay then, so what sort of political choices did they make?
Well, as most people know, the citizens of the Soviet Union had many of their rights taken away by the communist government. Every socialist leader used censorship, imprisonment, and even death to silence any sort of political opposition within the country. Stalin killed millions of people who had opposing viewpoints to his own.
Okay then, so what about the final leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev?
The role of Gorbachev stands in pretty stark contrast to that of Soviet leaders before him. Gorbachev spent his time in office as a reformer and a civil diplomat. Instead of killing or silencing those who opposed him, Gorbachev actually welcomed the mention of different political ideas with glasnost, or openness. The people of the USSR now were given a greater opportunity to express discontent with the government. Gorbachev also implemented perestroika, or reconstruction. This essentially made the USSR a more capitalist country, as it removed total government control over business. These two efforts were seen as great moral and political progress for a traditionally repressive society. These actions by Gorbachev earned him a Nobel Peace Prize in 1990.
Well, that sounds great. Well, why would the Union collapse so quickly after reforms like that?
Well, the problem is, the citizens of the Union were so upset that the economy was in such disarray that even these moderate reforms were basically like opening the floodgates. As soon as people were given the option to express their own ideas and discontent from the government, the communist government fell apart. This started in the eastern countries, with revolutions in Poland, Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, all within a couple of years of each other. The option for free elections in these countries, of course, led to all the communist leaders being taken out and centrist capitalists taking their place. Look at Bulgaria, for example. In their 1992 election, the capitalist nominee defeated the socialist nominee by almost 20%.
Whoa, that's really interesting. So what I'm going to have you do right now, Will, is we're going to play a game.
A game?
Exactly. So we're gonna call that game Random Cold War Facts and Stuff That Would Pertain to the Project.
Let's get to it.
Okay, Will, first question. What was one of the major differences between the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan? Keep in mind that both aim to lend support to European countries.
The Marshall Plan was meant to aid Europe by improving the economies of countries in need, while the Truman Doctrine implemented both military and economic aid. The major difference is that the Truman Doctrine was essentially the policy of containment we talked about before, and was created to prevent the spread of communism in any countries that were in danger of adopting a communist policy.
That is correct. Okay, well, second question. What did Gorbachev cite as the reason for his resignation?
Gorbachev, in his resignation address, cited a lack of resources and economic trouble as the reason for his resignation, and ultimately for the collapse. He wasn't wrong entirely, as average Soviet GDP per capita was around $8,700, while average US GDP per capita was around $24,000.
Whoa. Correct again, 2 for 2. So, final question, and the third question. What was the first Eastern country to leave the Union?
That would be Poland, which held its first democratic election since nearly the 1920s, in 1989. This was the first peaceful transition from communism to democracy.
Oh my god, Will, you got 3 for 3. That's the game, and Will, guess what you got?
What?
Nothing!
Typical.
Okay, so now back to the Cold War. Even though there is no event in history exactly like the Cold War and its collapse, there is an event in Russia's own history, which is the First Revolution in 1917, which shared some similarities with the collapse of the Cold War. Although the revolution was a violent, bloody, and incredibly troubled time in world history, and the fall of the Union was peaceful and entirely diplomatic, the goals of political uprisings were exactly the same. The people of Russia, in both cases, felt like they were underrepresented by their governments. They felt like they had no chance to move up economically, and they felt like their leaders were not looking out for their best interests. So the people of these countries rallied together and fought what they saw as an oppressive regime. The outcomes of both might have been different, but the goals were the same.